The 20th meeting of the Joint Select Committee on Land and Physical Infrastructure is hereby resumed. The purpose of this query is, of course, to understand the current state of the ferry service in Trinidad and Tobago, to examine the policies and procedures used to acquire ferries, and to ensure that value for money is obtained, to determine whether due diligence governed the conduct of all aspects of the maintenance and management of the provision of the sea bridge service, and to determine the changes and challenges with respect to the maintenance of ferries. All of this, of course, against the background of the procurement and maintenance services for ferries. Welcome and good afternoon to you, sir, Mr. Reginald Dumas. My name is Stephen Crease. I'm the chairman of the Joint Select Committee on Land and Physical Infrastructure, and on my left is...
My name is Wade Mark, member.
Lavelle Francis, member.
Franklin Khan, member.
Good afternoon, Rushton Parry, Vice Chairman.
Members are reminded to have their phones switched off or on vibrate or silent, and to deactivate their microphones when they are finished speaking. Welcome again, Mr. Dumas.
Thank you very much.
Do you care to make an opening statement?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon to you and to the members and to the staff. I should like to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and through you all the members of the committee for having been so good as to invite me to offer some thoughts on the sea bridge and some related issues. I have already submitted a document to the committee, and I shall therefore not waste any time by reading it out now. However, for the benefit of others present or viewing these proceedings, I shall mention the 9 main points in the document. First, procurement procedures. Second, callousness on the part of those charged with procuring a passenger ferry. Third, licensing of the Cabo Star. Fourth, the public shortcomings of the Port Authority. Fifth, the legal responsibility of the Minister of Works and Transport. Sixth, the Tobago hospitality industry. Seventh, foreign investment in Tobago. Eighth, the refusal of the Tobago House of Assembly to appear before this committee. Ninth, the views of ordinary residents of Tobago on the sea bridge difficulties. I now await your questions and comments. Thank you.
Members?
Yes, good evening, Mr. Reginald Dumas. As a distinguished citizen of the Republic of TNT, the first question I would like to ask on the issue of procurement is, do you believe that from your own assessment and evaluation of the procurement process involving the acquisition of both the Cabo Star and the Ocean Flower, would you want to share with us whether, from your perspective, sufficient due diligence would have been exercised by those with whom responsibility laid?
Thank you, Member. In my view, on the basis of what I have heard and read, the answer would be no. I do not think that sufficient due diligence was exercised.
Would you want to share with this committee as to why you would make that statement? Could you elaborate for us?
In my experience, and I speak as someone who has been in the Foreign Service and who has also been head of the public service, which includes the Foreign Service, if a firm offers to come into Trinidad and Tobago to do whatever, it may be a housing company, it may be a manufacturing company of some kind or other, one of the first things you do is do an assessment of this company. Now, obviously, Trinidad and Tobago, with limited resources, does not have the ability to go to the country X and country Y to do assessments of company X or Y. But there are business firms, business services firms, companies that do such assessments. One of which is a well-known company called Dun & Bradstreet. And I have, in my public service career, had the opportunity and reason to use Dun & Bradstreet to check on Company A or Company Y that is offered to come into Trinidad and Tobago for whatever reason. We contracted a firm called Bridgman's out of Vancouver. Fine. But the Dun & Bradstreet report on Bridgman's indicates that there were severe shortcomings. I have a copy of part of the report here myself. And I have to say that if such a report had been put before me, I would not have chosen Bridgman's to provide these services. But I do not know whether Dun & Bradstreet or any such company was approached. If Dun & Bradstreet had been approached and this report arrived before the management and the board of the port, then I find it impossible to understand how Bridgman's could have been chosen. But it is possible that no check was done. I don't know. I cannot say. Only the port management and the Port Authority Board can say. I cannot say. All I can say is that such a check should have been done, and if that check showed, and if it was done, it would have showed, that Bridgman's was in the sort of financial and other situation that appears to be, then that company should not have been chosen.
You said in your opening remarks that the Minister of Works and Transport had a legal responsibility. For what? Could you elaborate for us when you talk about a legal responsibility?
The Port Authority Act says at section 15, subsection 1, the President may from time to time give the authority, that is the Port Authority, directions of a special or general character on the policy to be followed in the exercise of the powers conferred and the duties imposed on the authority by or under this Act, in relation to matters that appear to the President to affect the public interests. And 15.2 says, the authority shall, as soon as practicable, give effect to all directions issued pursuant to subsection 1 that I have just read. Now, subsection 1 says the President, but it would be unwise for any President of Trinidad and Tobago, given the present constitution of Trinidad and Tobago, where we have a non-executive president, it would be most unwise for any president to assume that he or she can go to the port and give instructions on what to do and what not to do. Because that power is circumscribed by what appears in section 80, subsection 1 of the Constitution, which states, in part, in the exercise of his functions under this Constitution or any other law, which would include the Port Authority Act, the President shall act in accordance with the advice of the Cabinet or a minister acting under the general authority of the Cabinet, except in cases where other provision is made by the Constitution or such other law, for instance, where the President can appoint members of the Public Service Commission or the Integrity Commission in his own discretion. So that the President here under section 15, subsection 1 of the Port Authority, in effect means the Cabinet or a minister acting under the general authority of the Cabinet. That is what I mean by the legal authority of the Minister of Works and Transport.
You also are on public record, and you can clarify for us if that is so. Going on the newspapers can mislead the population at times, or we can be misled. Could you, based on what you have just said, indicate whether, because of your assessment and evaluation of this procurement process, called publicly for both the resignation of the Minister of Works and Transport as well as the entire board of the Port Authority, which is the commissioners, and why, if that statement is true on the public record, you would have done so?
I have indeed called for the resignation of the Minister of Works and Transport and of the board, which is really the authority under, to use the correct word in the Act, but let us say the board. I have indeed called for their resignations because I did not need investigations carried out by Mr. Mute or the Integrity Commission or this committee to indicate to me that there was a severe deficit where due diligence was concerned. In fact, it seemed to me an undue lack of diligence. And where callousness was concerned with regard to the welfare of the people of Trinidad and Tobago, with particular reference to the people of Tobago, who depend heavily on the sea bridge. The minister announced that at one stage that he had canceled the contract for the Ocean Flower, which I understand, and I agree with Mr. Parry. I too have heard that it is now docked in Chagaramas. I don't know what it is doing here, but that is a matter for others to answer. He had cancelled the contract, but this contract was cancelled in the full knowledge of the fact that there was no replacement vessel, and that the one other passenger ferry that was operating was in fact limping. The point has been made also by the Minister of Works and Transport that the ferry is now being underutilized and there's spare capacity. Of course there's spare capacity. People are afraid to travel by the ferry. And you heard this morning that the ferry didn't leave Tobago. I have a ticket to travel, which I have had since May. I was booked to travel from Tobago to Trinidad in late May and return in early June. I still have the ticket. I am afraid to go to the port because I have had the experience of going to the port, waiting for hours from 4:30 in the morning, and then being told at 2:30 in the afternoon that I could not travel. And these are not good experiences for people to have to go through. So, not only is it that this is outside the vacation period where perhaps not as many people travel anyway, because we are now September, but also people have been afraid to travel. And given what I have seen, and what indicates what is, I'm persuaded fully, is a lack of due diligence on the part of the port, and the callousness displayed by those who are responsible for the acquisition of a ferry. I had no hesitation in calling for the resignation of the minister, who under the Act is responsible as minister for giving directions, and of the board. And if I may say so, I take the opportunity of calling again now for their resignations.
Mr. Chairman, if you have one final question. Mr. Dumas, like you, I, as a member of this committee, was apprised a short while ago of the arrival of the Ocean Flower 2. Mr. Chairman, I have in my possession a letter which I want to read and ask Mr. Dumas to possibly give his comment on. This letter is dated the 8th of September 2017. It comes from a company called Ken Shipping and Marine Services Limited, address Freeport, Central Trinidad, West Indies. It is addressed to the officer in charge of the Immigration Boarding Station, Port of Spain. It reads, "Dear Sir, Madam, notice of arrival, MV Ocean Flower 2. We, Ken Shipping and Marine Services Limited, agents for the subject vessel, wish to advise that MV Ocean Flower 2 is expected to arrive in Trinidad and Tobago on the 12th of September 2017 at 0930 hours /10/1000 hours. So it's between 9:30 and 10 this morning. The vessel is arriving in Chaguaramas for dry docking. The boarding representatives for the agency is Mr. Sheldon Poonsami, that will be boarding and entering the vessel into Chaguaramas. Your kind services therefore requested to board and clear in this vessel into Trinidad and Tobago for repairs. We will also be requesting a roomage once the dry dock has advised on the day of the docking. The last port of call is Curacao. The number of crew, including the captain, is 13, and the captain name is Alan Coitme. Again, my best regards. Yours faithfully, Ken Lester Kenny. He's apparently the owner of this company. I want to ask you, what would be your interpretation of this letter, particularly in light of the fact that the public was told that that vessel and the arrangement, because of their late arrival, was canceled? And what would be your interpretation of their arrival in the context of an irrevocable letter of credit, which I understand amount to some $8 million US? Could you share with us from your experience and what you have just shared with us and what I've just read to consolidate what you have tendered? What would be your interpretation and submission on this development for the taxpayers and people of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, Senator, I can only speculate. If the contract was canceled, and this was announced in early August, the contract for the Ocean Flower was canceled. And the Ocean Flower turns up in September in Trinidad and Tobago. It could be perfectly innocent. It may have come for dry docking. It has had a long route, after all. It came out of Japan, or Korea, rather. It then went to Japan. It then went to Alaska, because I was following it, as you can, on the website. You have a number of these websites that you can follow the movement of boats. It went to Alaska, to a couple of places in Alaska, actually. Then it went to Mexico, where it spent a little time. Then it got to Panama. Then it got to Curacao. The poor boat is tired. It needs to be dry docked. You can take that view, that there are parts that need to be replaced or repaired or whatever. But one could take another view, and you mentioned an irrevocable letter of credit. And the other view is that, and this is for others to answer because I can only speculate, the other view would be that the irrevocable letter of credit has legal force, despite what was announced about the cancellation, and that the legal implications, coupled with the fact that you have only one limping ferry at the moment, might have caused a change of heart on the part of those responsible, and that we will be seeing the Ocean Flower operating between Trinidad and Tobago in the not-too-distant future. But as I say, all I can do is speculate. I don't know. We will have to have a statement from the relevant people, that is to say from Mr. Kenny, who apparently is the agent, as to if there's more to this appearance of the boat than dry docking. The minister responsible may also wish to issue a statement. But I think all we can do now is speculate.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Dumas. I know that you are not a material witness with specific reference to either maintenance or procurement in the whole process of these vessels. But what I do appreciate is your history in the public service, your experience over the years, and perhaps that perspective, to me, is what is important to this committee, because if we don't know where we came from, we have a problem going forward. And I have one or two questions, which I know you are very cautious in your responses so far. But I want to ask a question, and hopefully within 2 or 3 minutes, you will get the gist of where I want to go. And the first question I want to ask, in your view, is Trinidad and Tobago a society where corruption and allegations of corruption is endemic in this society? What is your take on that?
Yes,
Yes.
and has been for decades.
Second question, Mr. Dumas. Following that, we have had institutions over the years built by successive governments where there have been allegations of corruption, from the airport to the Brian Lara Stadium to this very same building that we're sitting in. Is that cause for the public not to utilize these facilities because of these allegations?
What, I'm not sure I follow. Was there a call from?
No, there was no call. The Prime Minister made a few statements when he gave evidence before this committee on Monday night. And what was most apparent to me in his contribution, with specific reference to the vessel that was servicing the route between Trinidad and Tobago over the last year and a half or so, although the data shows over 95% operational uptime performance, the folks in Tobago would have spoken about the ease of the business for the last year and a half with that particular vessel. One got the view that the Prime Minister's position was, look, this vessel, there is serious allegations of, as he put it, a den of corruption and iniquity. And I got the view that his position was that we ought not, no matter how good this vessel is performing, we will not entertain any business with this vessel anymore. I got that impression from his words, his verbatim. So the question that I was trying to get at, if over the years in the history of this country, institutions and buildings have been built and there have been allegations of corruption and all kind of things, is the Prime Minister's, or was the Prime Minister's position a sound one? Because we are using facilities that are littered with allegations of corruption. So his position was that no matter what was in place with the Galicia, because of those allegations and documentation that he said he had, he was of the view that they will form no part of the business going forward. So that is what I wanted to get a comment from.
I was looking at the session that you all had on Monday, and my understanding of or recollection of what the Prime Minister said was that the port was, I don't know if he used the word den, but I think that is what he meant, of corruption and iniquity. The port, as distinct from a boat. Now, again, this is not new. We have been hearing this for decades. Bring back Fodi Ferreira, he will tell you that the port has been known as a place where if you want to make money fast, you go and work there. Overtime is given for work that is never done. I'm talking about the allegations now. I'm not making a charge because I haven't done any investigation of the port. And indeed, I think the government has recently set up a committee to look at the port, headed by a gentleman, a former soldier, retired member of the Defense Force. And some years ago, there was, I think, a Public Accounts Committee report on the port operations. There have been many investigations of the port, and we still continue in 2017, in spite of all of these investigations and all the recommendations, to say how corrupt the port is. Now, something has to be wrong with us as a people. Something has to be seriously wrong with us, that we spend so much time and energy, and I confess that I perhaps am one of those too, criticizing this, making recommendations on that, etc., and the same thing continues. There was a poll just recently in the newspapers, I think it was the Express, and people were asked about corruption. A substantial majority indicated that they were sick and tired of corruption, and corruption was a major concern for them, etc., etc. So it's a major concern, but we continue to be corrupt. Something is not right. Maybe we all need to go to a good psychiatrist. I don't know. Because there is a contradiction there all the time. If something is built or bought that involves corruption, or is said to have involved corruption, you cannot just say, I am not going to use it because it involved corruption, because virtually everything that we say in this place, we can find a reason to say involved corruption, in which case we wouldn't be using anything.
And that is the point that I was trying to probably get some clarity on, to make sure that I am not misguided in terms of my position, which you share clearly. I want to talk briefly on the Dun & Bradstreet report, because during testimony given by one of the commissioners, I had raised that question on whether the data that was presented in the Dun & Bradstreet report, which I'm absolutely familiar with as a businessman, whether that data was sufficient enough to give the rating to Bridgman on the tender evaluation. And what I was told was that according to the tenders committee rules, all they required from that Dun & Bradstreet report was a position that the business has no liens and judgments against them. And my proposition was, as a tender evaluations committee, wouldn't the fact that everything else in that document was blank, shouldn't that have given the people who are evaluating a heads up that something may be off here? So the question that I want to ask is, should these committees have the, I don't know if you want to use the word power, but the ability to use more discretion in terms of how do we accept data when it's provided in a lump sum, although we only require a little piece, but the balance ought to guide us in a particular way. And before you respond, I have a document here that is dated June 16, 2017, from the Port Authority to the Acting Permanent Secretary, Ms. Danmati Ramdat, where they have inserted the cabinet notes and all the necessary paperwork for her to take through the ministry to cabinet and so on. But what is instructive is that Ms. Charmaine Lewis, who is the Port Authority chairman, in her last paragraph, sorry, no, the CEO of the Port Authority, that's correct. She gives a paragraph, and if I could just read it for the record. In addition to the above-mentioned submission, the management of the Port Authority is also including the Dun and Bradstreet report on Bridgeman Services Group Limited for the review of the Ministry of Works and Transport. So, clearly to me, Ms. Lewis, in understanding her role, she says, well, look, the Port Authority board has sent us this. I have to forward it to you. But I want you to pay attention to the Dun and Bradstreet report before you take these things to cabinet. And then the Prime Minister says in his evidence that because of the critical nature and the urgent nature, everybody busy sign off, even Danmati, Ms. Ramdat. She challenged the minister in her writings that, listen, I'm not too sure about this. And then she was persuaded to sign these things off. But this, you have Ms. Lewis saying, hey, read this report. So my question is that you have asked that the minister and the port should offer their resignations. But what about the people below them? You know, you have your permanent secretaries, people in the Attorney General's office, independent councils. Nobody saw this as a red flag before they advised the Honorable Prime Minister to sign off on this thing. So in terms of your experience, is this the behavior that has permeated the public service over the years, sir?
To an extent, yes, I'm sorry to say. But let me start with your question about the Dun and Bradstreet report and the statement that all they were interested in is seeing whether there was any lien on the company. If that was said, I have to say that from my own public service experience, that is an absurd statement to make. Let me give you an example from my own experience as a public servant. When I was permanent secretary to the Prime Minister, this was A&R Robinson, it came to my notice that a particular cabinet minister was very interested in having a particular project which involved a foreign company. And he was constantly calling the Prime Minister's office, and he would call me too, about this project. He wanted to bring this company in because, you know, this company was an excellent company, an American company, to do this project. So I decided I would do a Dun and Bradstreet report or check. And I got in touch with our embassy in Washington, which at the time certainly probably still does, had a subscription to Dun & Bradstreet. And I said, could you check this company out for me, please? The report came back a couple of weeks later. There was no lien on the company. But here was a company that had a total capital of $5,000, US dollars, admittedly, but $5,000. This involved a housing project, and the company had never built a house. Now, using the argument that or the criterion that you put before me there, that since there was no lien on the company, one could say to the company, go ahead. That would have struck me then as absurd, and it strikes me now as absurd. And so what I did simply was go to the Prime Minister with the documents and say, your minister is, I think, straying off the beaten track. And he might pull your government with it. You have to deal with the minister, not I, because he's your minister. You put him in the cabinet. I am to advise you, and I advise you, as Prime Minister, stop this thing at once. Because clearly something else is involved. And you and I know what else is involved. And that was that. Where public servants are concerned, they frequently receive instructions from ministers, usually oral instructions. When the minister knows, and he knows that the permanent secretary knows, the instruction is not a valid one. There are ministers in this room, or people who have been. And I'm sure that neither of them has done anything of the kind. But there have been ministers who will tell the permanent secretary to do something. And what the permanent secretary should do at that point, knowing that what has been said to him or her is not good, is not in the best interest of Trinidad and Tobago, is to say, Minister, would you please put that in writing? At least one minister agrees with me. And that generally stops the thing in its tracks. It has happened to me too. Again, I speak from personal experience, where a cabinet minister has said to his permanent secretary, get in touch with Dumas and tell him to do such and such. And the permanent secretary calls me and said, the minister say. I said, but you know that that is not correct. Why are you calling me? What kind of permanent secretary are you? To call me as head of the public service to say your minister say I should do something that you know is wrong? You tell the minister for me. Dumas say he ain't doing it. And he will do what he knows to be the correct thing. And if he has a problem with that reply, he can take it up with the Prime Minister. End of story.
Mr. Dumas, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Minister. Member, sorry, not Minister.
Many hats. Just a point of clarification. I listened with intent to the Prime Minister on Monday, and I'm quite sure that he stated that the non-renewal of the Galicia had nothing to do with his personal qualms about corruption, but had to do with his feeling that the state was being strong-armed into an untenable arrangement. That was the reason he provided. So just to clarify in reference to the question of the Vice Chair. So Dumas, the Prime Minister proffered apology to Tobagonians for this entire scenario. As a Tobagonian yourself, do you accept that apology?
Well, look at that. I'm perfectly sure. I know the Prime Minister. I've known him for years. And I'm perfectly sure that his apology was genuine. And as a Tobagonian, I accept the apology. I'm sure there are lots of Tobagonians also who accept the apology. I may, however, add that the Prime Minister also said on Monday that, there were people sending photographs of empty supermarket shelves and this kind of thing. And that did not go down particularly well with a lot of Tobagonians.
I can accept that.
Okay.
Mr. Dumas, he underpinned his apology with the explanation that sometimes, at least in reference to the cargo issue, not so much the passenger issue, that at times the state is forced to make the right decision and that there might be some negative fallout from it. Do you accept that?
Yes. I mean, a government can't please everybody. That's simply not possible. There are things that have to be done. Not even a permanent secretary can please everybody, let alone a government. There are things that have to be done. It happens all the time. It happens in families. It happens in offices, and so on. Decisions have to be taken that are going to offend certain people, are going to upset certain people. But if the decision can be seen and shown to be in the best interest of the overall body, in this case, Trinidad and Tobago, because I have spent enough time representing Trinidad and Tobago to have it burnt into my DNA that the most important thing here is the welfare of Trinidad and Tobago at all times. If it can be shown that the decision taken, however badly it may affect some people, is in the best interest of the country, then, and if one can sit down and say, listen, I know that this affects you badly, but I had to do this because so-and-so, then people will grumble, yes, but they will eventually accept.
And now the fundamental question. It is my contention that this exercise must not be a talk shop. Since I've been a child, I've been looking at procedures like these, where people like yourself come and talk, and you have a lot of interesting and important things to say. And then, as you've said already this afternoon, nothing happens. It is not for me to discount the hurt suffered by Tobagonians. That would be callous and also stupid. But it is my contention from the evidence I've heard for the last 2 weeks that the issues with the ferry are a subset of the larger problem, which is a malfunctioning port. Would you agree?
It's not only the port.
Well, I don't want to go into the societal wide issue because then we'll
we have to.
Yeah.
We don't have to go into any detail now, but the broader issue is the society. And in this particular case, the relationship between Trinidad and Tobago.
Yeah.
we have to sort this out. It's not only a constitutional relationship, it's also, to a large extent, as a matter of fact, a psychological relationship.
It is.
How each
Cultural
side
relationship.
views the other. A Tobagonian, or many Tobagonians will say they like we in Trinidad. But a lot of Trinidadians say they like we in Tobago.
After 100+ years. Yes.
So it's to a large extent a question of perception. Also a question of how how people see things and how words are used and how they are interpreted. For instance, the word ward, which was used this morning. People were taught in Trinidad, in schools in Trinidad, that Tobago is or was a ward of Trinidad. Now, the word ward suggests a ward of court. In other words, that Tobago is a dependent child. Whereas, in fact, it was the British in their administrative arrangements when they joined the two islands together from January 1st, 1899, that made Tobago a ward, meaning an administrative district in the colony of Trinidad and Tobago. That is what ward means. And all this nonsense you hear about how Tobago dependent on Trinidad and is a ward and so on, foolishness. But the point is that that is what is taught in schools in Trinidad, as distinct from Tobago.
True. All right, here's my contention. I like the idea and then the execution of fixing things. That's why I got involved in politics, the intention of trying to fix things. It's impossible to try to fix everything at the same time.
You can't fix everything at this.
But we need to fix
Not possible.
We need to fix the port. And short of potentially firing a board or firing a management, which are procedural things that can be done, I want the cliff notes, and I've been asking a number of people this question, and I've not yet gotten an answer that satisfies me. Because I understand what culture is and how endemic it can be. And if corruption is cultural, then I could suggest removing a board and removing a management changes nothing.
In a sense, yes,
Yeah.
I agree. I mean, you have to look at
We
the
need,
structures.
we have a port that loses $400 million a year and cannot provide effectively the services we require now. And that has to be fixed in the shortest possible time. I'm asking you, as a public servant of great renown and experience, aside from the perhaps knee-jerk reaction, and maybe rightfully so, of removing those who might be found to be culpable for this, how do we begin addressing this problem? At the end of the day, something fundamental must come out of this entire experience besides talk.
You have to start by talking. And you have to start by talking in a certain way. If you talk in a confrontational way, everything is going to backfire. You have to sit down and say, what are the issues? You can find someone who is respected in the country, who is not involved in any of, is not a person of the port, not a person. No. I have my writing to do, and I have my third volume of my recollections to do, and if you don't mind, I'm getting older, and I have to finish them quickly. Otherwise, you never know. Someone to sit down, you're doing an investigation, but, quietly. You're not going in there with a view to, or giving the impression that you're going in there with a view to finding fault. You're going in there to get information. You're going in there to ask questions. What is wrong? Is anything wrong? If anything is wrong, what is wrong? How did it become wrong? What is to be done to fix it? A lot of these things will take a long, long time, of course. You can't just do things overnight, especially when you have an entrenched system in a particular area. And it will take time. In these small societies like Trinidad and Tobago, we tend to spend too much time in confrontation, too much time pointing fingers, too much time blaming others for shortcomings. Saying, as we do it all the time in Trinidad, I know what they're doing now, as if we, who are making these charges, have no responsibilities at all. As if we don't live here. It is they who live here. And it is their fault. So you have to have a couple of people, not any large team, 3, 4 people, no more. Because too large is a waste of time, and too small might put too much pressure on any one individual. 3, 4 people to talk. Out of this committee's deliberations will come a report. I trust, Mr. Chairman, will come a report with recommendations, presumably. These things have to be not only put down in writing and submitted to the Parliament or made public or whatever, they have to be monitored as well. Because again, we are not very good at monitoring. We say we have done a report and we have made recommendations, and then the report just stays on a shelf. Look at the number of reports we have done on the port over the years. And what has happened? So it's like CARICOM almost. Plenty of reports. Ramphal did something, an excellent book, Time for Action. You know what happened? When he talked about having a monitoring mechanism to see that the decisions of the CARICOM heads were in fact implemented and carried out, etc., etc., heads, including one who really surprised me, I'm not going to mention his name, said, but he can't tell us that. He, Ramphal. We are heads of government. If we wish to carry out the recommendations that we ourselves made, that's up to us. And if we don't want to carry them out, we ain't carrying them out. And then you say, CARICOM is in bad shape? Of course it's in bad shape. Because in these small societies, that is what you get all the time. The top-down attitudes. The person on top is the power. I am a minister. I am a chief secretary. I am a chairman of a board. I am an ambassador. I am a this and a that. And you're always looking down on the people below and kicking them down to make them stay down too. So it can be done. But it will have to be done in a different way. You can't merely have a report with recommendations. You have to have a report that people will read, that a team that will go into the various areas in the port and elsewhere, talk to people, get their views, use the recommendations, and involve them in the report. Again, from my own experience many years ago, when I was doing something on the public service, I had a small team going around to the various ministries to speak to them. I appointed one person, 2 people, and the chief personnel officer, also one, and I made sure that the Public Services Association was represented. I called the president at the time, and I said, would you nominate somebody for this team? And this team went around, went to several ministries, did reports, etc., which unfortunately never saw the light of day because a certain event happened in 1990 that we all know about, and everything fell apart.
First of all, two small points, Mr. Chair, through you to Mr. Dumas. I just want to correct the records. I mentioned 8 million US as a letter of credit. My information was wrong. It is 3 million US letter of credit issued by the First Citizens Bank. So I just wanted to correct the record here. I also wanted to ask you, given the importance of the sea bridge and the ferry service and the matter that is facing Tobago, you did mention the matter of the Tobago House of Assembly and its failure not to appear before the Joint Select Committee or not to accept the invitation issued by the Joint Select Committee on the grounds that central government is responsible and not the THA for air and sea transportation. You care to share with us your views on that particular matter?
Well, in my submission to the committee, thank you, member. In my submission to the committee, I said I was astounded by the decision of the Tobago House of Assembly to decline to appear. I remain astounded. Because the ground that the Tobago House of Assembly gave was that the management of the airports and seaports of Trinidad and Tobago falls under the purview of the central government and its agents, the board of directors. Well, we have a Tobago House of Assembly Act. And the 5th schedule of the Act is headed Areas of Responsibility of the Assembly. Responsibility. And there are a number of areas, number 16 of which is infrastructure, including air and sea transportation, wharves and airports and public utilities. Now, it is true that that 5th schedule must be looked at together with Section 25, subsection 1 of the Act, which says, without prejudice to Section 75, subsection 1 of the Constitution, the Assembly shall, in relation to Tobago, be responsible for the formulation and implementation of policy in respect of the matters set out in the 5th schedule, which would include air and sea transportation. And I suppose it could be argued that the Assembly does not have total responsibility over these, because it says, without prejudice to Section 75(1) and Section 75(1) of the Constitution says, there shall be a cabinet for Trinidad and Tobago, which shall have the general direction and control of the government of Trinidad and Tobago and shall be collectively responsible, therefore, to Parliament. So that it would be legally correct, I think, to say that the areas of responsibility set out in the 5th schedule that the THA has, in the THA Act, are not unfettered, that they fall within the framework of Section 75(1), which talks about the Cabinet having the general direction and control of the government. Nonetheless, successive chief secretaries from 1996, when the THA came into being, that is, first Ho Choy Charles, then Orville London, have made a virtue of talking about the powers of the Assembly under the 5th schedule. The same 5th schedule that has infrastructure, including air and sea transportation. So it's a little strange that in 2017, suddenly a new chief secretary says, this is really a central government matter. If it is only a central government matter, what is it doing in the THA Act? As an area of responsibility of the Tobago House of Assembly. It is not only that. The Port Authority Act, at Section 8, speaks of the 8.1 speaks of the function of the authority. Section 8.2 sets out some definitions, because really the functions of the authority are to develop the harbors of Trinidad and Tobago and to operate port services in accordance with this act. So those two functions. And operate the government shipping service between Trinidad and Tobago, collect dues and charges, and generally to be responsible for the carrying out of this act. And then they talk about the development of the harbors. And then in subsection 3 of that section 8, we read, notwithstanding the provisions of subsection 2A, the Tobago House of Assembly is charged with the responsibility of constructing, maintaining, and repairing storage and warehousing facilities at ports in Tobago. Now, if you are going to construct, maintain, and repair, you have a management responsibility. And this is specifically stated. Your powers here of the Tobago House of Assembly, that power is specifically stated at Section 8, subsection 3 of the Port Authority Act. How, therefore, could the legal advisor to the Chief Secretary of the Tobago House of Assembly write a letter saying that all of this falls under the purview of the central government? I don't know, but it strikes me as being worse than that. If these matters here under the 5th schedule fall under the purview of the central government, then the THA has no responsibility for anything. Because you can't single out one thing and says that is under the purview of the central government, whereas the other things are for us. Everything must logically fall under the purview of the central government. Therefore, it seems to me that the Chief Secretary has made an excellent argument for the abolition of the Tobago House of Assembly as at present constituted. Maybe that is his intention, I don't know. But that, logically, is what he is saying. I find it odd also that he should have said that, Because on the 17th of May this year, the Chief Secretary gave a televised address to the residents of Tobago on a number of issues, including the sea bridge. You are aware, he said, that Tobago has been plagued by an unpredictable sea transport situation. This is May this year, which has unfortunately affected residents on the island. This was marked mainly by this transitioning from the previous ferry arrangement and the resulting interim arrangement as we, who are we? As we pursue a satisfactory and permanent solution. We can't be speaking on behalf of the central government. Who are we? The Assembly apologizes on behalf of the authorities for the inconvenience and hardships that we have all suffered. But he can't be speaking on behalf of the central government, could he? And he ends that part by saying, as your Chief Secretary, your concern has always been my concern. My focus is on finding an acceptable solution that is both predictable and reliable. That is the Chief Secretary of the Tobago House of Assembly speaking in May. How, therefore, in September, is it a matter for the central government only? I don't understand. And in any case, Mr. Chairman, even if this was not in the law, even if there were nothing in the THA Act of 1996 or in the Port Authority Act, it strikes me that a Chief Secretary of the Tobago House of Assembly should have appeared before this committee to give the views of the people of Tobago. You saw in my submission, which all of you have, that I consulted a number of people in Tobago. I called people in Charlottesville, I called people in Castara, I called people in Mason Hall, I called people in Glamorgan, Scarborough and environs, etc. Tell me if the sea bridge issue is affecting you, and if so, how? And I got a number of responses, which I have summarized and put in the submission that you all have. How is it I could do that? Or maybe I want to be Chief Secretary. Who knows? Maybe I should stop my memoirs and look elsewhere. Thank you.
Mr. Dumas, in your dealings throughout the years, in public service, have you come across the Transport Board?
No, I had no dealings with the Transport Board.
Oh, so you're not familiar with...
No, I mean, I know of it, but that's about it.
Okay, but you're unfamiliar with its
No.
particular frame of reference?
No.
Okay. The other issue I wanted some clarification on relates to the whole question of due diligence and the Dun and Bradstreet report. Because what I find disturbing about that is at the various levels, the public servants concerned seem unwilling to say unequivocally, listen, I am disassociating myself with furtherance of this exercise because I consider the information that is inherent in that report to make doing business with this particular company, totally reprehensible. And I find at the various levels, nobody stood up and said, Mr. Minister or Mr. Chairman, we ought not to go further with this. And unless I'm convinced otherwise, I feel that is the election of duty. That they should have made a clear and equivocal statement that we ought not to proceed with this firm given this information. I don't know if you share that view.
I do. From all I've been hearing, Mr. Chairman, members, from all I've been hearing in the last few years, the public service, as I knew it, doesn't exist to the same extent in terms of backbone. My mentors in the public service were people like, names that perhaps you're not familiar with, but people like Dodger Jalin, people like Eugenio Moore, people like Frank Bassotti, people like Frank Rampersad, and so on. I remember Frank once, he was permanent secretary in finance, and he had been made by Chambers, who was then the prime minister, chairman of Caroni. And there was a meeting one day, and Chambers, as prime minister, said, well, I instruct you as chairman to do such and such. And Frank said, hold it right there, prime minister. Sorry. You can appoint me chairman of Caroni, the board, and you can remove me. But you can't tell me what to do. If you don't like what I do, you have the full authority to remove me. But you cannot say that I should do this or I should not do that. That generation of public servant, so I understand, because I keep my distance now. I'm working on my recollections, you see, so I keep my distance from these things. That generation of public servant is to a large extent no longer with us. It is part of the decline of our institutions in this country. And I keep saying, and I've written it several times, that a country without proper institutions is no kind of country. But we're seeing it around us. I don't have to call any names. You have in the United States now a president who has certain views on life. Which don't necessarily coincide with what is good and proper all the time. But what you have in the United States at the same time is strong institutions that are pushing back and are saying, you can't do that. This is what should be done, not that. He's, of course, getting very annoyed, but the point is that the institutions are standing up. I'm afraid that in Trinidad and Tobago, and it's a source of great distress to me, because I will not be around for too much longer. What is happening is that the institutions are collapsing. And the public service would appear to be one of them. but it's not only the public service. One of the first articles I wrote, and I write an occasional article in the newspaper, was in 1995, when the then Prime Minister, Patrick Manning, assailed the public service or the service commissions, saying that they were a relic of colonialism, and they needed to be abolished, and so on, etc., and kicked them out. They were standing in the way of progress, and so on and so on and so on. And I wrote an article saying that Mr. Manning's analysis was bereft of historical accuracy. That the person who had pushed hardest for a public service commission was Eric Williams. Because he wished to have the institution there as a buffer between the public servant and the politician, because otherwise the politician would simply say to the public servant, I want you to do this, do that, and you better do this or else. And since it's a small society, people are afraid of victimization. So I agree with you. Things ain't what they used to be. I am now, at this moment, on a cabinet-appointed committee looking at a particular aspect of the public service. This is something that has come up in our discussions. Even though I am trying hard to finish my recollections, I have yet offered to meet with people and to talk to people about my experiences and what I think they should do and what they should not do, etc., in the public service, because in the final analysis, I am nowhere to run. I am not one of those with nationalities abroad and houses and townhouses in Miami and Fort Lauderdale and so on. I just stay here. It's the only country I have. And I have, therefore, it seems to me, to do my damnedest to help the country. Not that people are going to agree with me on everything or any more than I agree with them, but I don't want anyone to question my commitment to Trinidad and Tobago. So, yes, there has been dereliction of duty. Yes, the institutions are collapsing. Yes, it is up to us, not to them, whoever they may be. It is up to us as a society to do what we can to stop the rot and to try to reverse it. Which is why, you're quite right, member, I would desperately hope that something comes out of this committee, of the deliberations of this committee, that will be positive, not merely for the port as such, but for port and related issues, if you like, that will be positive for Trinidad and Tobago, and that would redound to the benefit of Trinidad and Tobago.
I can't avoid it. Being a student of government and public administration, and contrary to those newspapers who have been giving me a PhD, my JSC is in government and public administration. And I was seeing this in terms of three levels. One at the personal level, the public servant, and you refer to it in terms of, say, the caliber and the bravery, as it were, of public servants today in terms of standing up to whoever would be supervising them, whether it is a permanent secretary or a minister supervising them. And that clearly is one level on which this thing has collapsed. The other level I find is, which relates more to the question of governance, in that I didn't get a sense in all the documentation that came before us that there were policy guidelines and manuals that, you know, given the age of some of these institutions, should have been floating around and should have been cited by witnesses, you know, whether they believe whichever side may have been corrupt or guilty of malfeasance and so on. But there was an absence of citation of those kinds of documents. And these are institutions that are around for decades. And I find it passing strange that that kind of documentation or reference to that kind of documentation has not emerged. And I wanted your comment about that, whether in your years in the public service, you found that these authorities, these state companies which were formed by central government, have developed that kind of level of administration.
There is, of course, a state enterprise monitoring manual. That's for the state enterprises. The state enterprises were set up because it was felt that the public service was too slow and that you'd have these things that would be separate and they could operate quickly on a kind of private sector basis. This hasn't turned out to be quite what was thought to be the case at the beginning. The Petrotrin thing is only the most recent example of what not to do. But it's not the only one. And we have a number of other enterprises. We had these special purpose companies that were set up as well under Patrick Manning, which haven't worked very well either. We have these layers of bureaucracy. We appoint a lot of people, quite often on a party basis. So many square pegs in round holes that often I feel we should apologize both to the pegs and to the holes. Paying a lot of money to these people because they get much higher salaries than in the public service generally. To do what? I don't know. The whole governmental system has to be revamped. And I made a recommendation a long time ago that we bring in somebody from Singapore, because Singapore knows how to do it. Lee Kuan Yew sort of set up a system there. Mind you, he was a bit of a dictator, I accept. A Democrat, he was not. But he got things done. And the public service in Singapore, and the public sector in Singapore generally, operates very efficiently indeed. We have a lot of bodies that we don't even need to have. We have a lot of overlapping bodies. Boards, enterprises, and bodies all over the place. I mean, I once got not in this administration, but in the last one, a list of all these things, and I was horrified by what I saw. And the taxpayer is paying for all of this, and we don't know what the benefits are, or if there are any benefits at all. The issue of manuals is something that I don't want to go into the details of what has been happening at this cabinet-appointed committee that I just mentioned, but that is one of the things that have come up, the question of a manual or some kind of manual to show people what to do, because it turns out that there are a lot of people now in the public service, especially the younger ones, who don't have an idea what to do. Again, I come back to the issue of the institution. What happens to the institution? If the people in the institution don't have a clue about the institution or have a skewed idea of the institution, how can they properly function within the institution? How can they improve the institution? So yes, all of this has to be done, but not by me.
The third aspect that I was concerned about, given what has been coming forward, is the disparity between operating systems or, standard operating procedures and what actually takes place and the extent to which there is supportive legislation or there's a superfluous legislation or a surplus of legislation. Because what I find increasingly happening is that our attorney generals are becoming the stars of the show. And they are filling Hansard with laws and clause. And people are largely unfamiliar with it. And they're not really being operationalized. And at the end of the day, given our history of corrupt activity, to me, the most significant legislation that would precede all others would be whistleblower legislation. And I'm seeking your comment as to the extent to which we have the cart in front of the horse when it comes to the issue of whistleblower legislation in an environment we have all conceded to have had a history of decades, I think was the phrase used earlier, of corruption.
Yeah. The PNM came into office in 1956 on a platform, among other things. There were a number of other things. But one of the elements of the platform was morality in public affairs. And the PNM promised to eradicate, that was the word used, graft and corruption. That was 1956. 60 years later, we are complaining about graft and corruption. It's not only the fault of the PNM. I'm simply using the PNM as an historical signpost. The fault is ours. We can't point a finger at this party or that party or the other party. All of us are to blame. All of us. How we go about dealing with it, I don't know. Yes, you can have legislation. Yes, you can have a number of busy attorneys general about the place. But legislation in itself is not going to stop corruption. It might look good on the books. You have to start early o'clock with children, if not in preschool, certainly in primary school. By the time they get to secondary school, their minds are already formed, so forget that. You have to start down here. To teach values education, among other things. We spend a lot of our time in this country concentrating on preparing children to pass exams. We have so many scholarships, and then when the results come out, you have these children talking about how much stress there was, and so much they had to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and so on, etc., etc. I remain unimpressed because I won a scholarship, and in my day there were 4 for the entire country. Now there are 400 and something, and the country is not 100 times bigger in population. And I know from my travels that education goes beyond doing well in your algebra tests or your English tests or your social studies test or whatever it is. So we need to look at education and the type of education we give. If you look at what is happening in the world, you will find that the countries that are now ahead in the world, at the top, in terms of the quality of education given, are the Asian countries, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Shanghai in China, with one European country in the top 5 or 6, Finland. The United States is way down, and I don't want to tell you where Trinidad and Tobago is. We're doing things the wrong way, and we are falling behind. And we cannot talk in terms, as we do all the time, about diversification, and we're going to change the economy. If you don't know, if you do not know in the first place how to think critically, how can you think about diversification? What are you diversifying? You don't know what to do. So, yes, you have attorneys general. Yes, you have legislation. The legislation, in any case, is not monitored. But the legislation, even if it is monitored, has to be supported by a system, a strong system of education, and in this country, revamped education. Mr. Minister, sir, revamped education. Not the kind of education that we have today in Trinidad and Tobago. A completely different type of education to meet the challenges that are coming, that are already here in the 21st century, let alone beyond.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Dumas. Mr. Dumas, as enlightening as your discussion is, I think we're drifting a little off
I know you're
course
sorry.
at this point in time, because we have listened to your articulation of the shortcomings of the public service manifesting itself through time, the whole issue of education and what have you. But with regard to the specific focus of this inquiry, it has to do largely with procurement, and secondly with fixing the situation as a way forward. Procurement involves, based on our terms of reference, from the Galicia to the transporter to the provider to the Cabo Star to the ocean flower and matters pertaining there too. I just want to make the point that in showing mismanagement, incompetence, and negligence, I mean, you see it from the outcome of what has happened. But, and at best, that is what happened. At worst, there was probably impropriety or malfeasance. But I just want to be careful and make the distinction that in malfeasance and impropriety, you need documentary evidence, and you need evidence that could stand scrutiny. Mismanagement, incompetence.
I didn't accuse anyone of
No.
malfeasance.
That's what I'm saying. So,
Yeah.
mismanagement, incompetence, and negligence is subject to interpretation based on the outcome of what input you have put into the issue. So, with that in context, you know, we have had a lot of people appearing before this inquiry, obviously not with first-hand evidence or information, sometimes implying implicitly or explicitly by reference that something proper did not happen, and that may well be so. But again, the evidence as proposed before us, we will study it and make our recommendation. With regards to the way forward, the Tobago Hotel and Tourism Association did make a case for more Tobago involvement. They claim in the Port Authority, but my specific reference, the Port Authority has other, like a container business and what have you, for Trinidad and by extension Tobago. But the inter-island ferry service, it is my view that, and as a former Minister of Works myself, that the Tobago House of Assembly, the people of Tobago and the interests of Tobago should be better represented. I know you probably haven't seen their submission, but they're proposing something called a special purpose vehicle, which will involve, by and large, a significant, if not entirely, Tobago component in managing that service, probably procuring the vessels and matters pertaining thereto. As a Tobagonian, now retired, and somebody who is intrinsically familiar with the system, what are you thinking on that?
Well, I would certainly not go along with Tobago organization unless I was assured that it could be handled properly. Because if you just say, have a Tobago organization because it is Tobago, and forget in any case that this service serves Trinidad as well, and forget that you have to have skills of management in marine affairs, in ship repair, etc., then you're going to make things worse than before. So I am not a Tobago chauvinist. I have spent too many years representing Trinidad and Tobago for me to say that everything must be Tobago as distinct from Trinidad. If, as I said, the thing can be handled, run, monitored properly, effectively, efficiently in Tobago, by Tobagonians only, fine. But is that the case? I don't know.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks. Yeah.
Laura, what?
Mr. Dumas, I just want to ask, you made reference to the Don and Bradstreet report. I just want to ask you, if the Don and Bradstreet report showed up a day after the tender decision would have been made, do you think that that decision should have been revisited in light of that report not being in the possession of the decision makers at the material time? Do you think that the tender ought to have been referred back to the tenders committee for its consideration?
I have two answers. One, why would a decision have been made before the Dun & Bradstreet report arrived if the Dun & Bradstreet report had been requested? Two, if the pressures were such that the decision had to be made even before the Dun & Bradstreet report arrived, and it got there the day after the decision, then yes, I would certainly have looked at this again and said, listen, I think we better go back to the tenders committee. This seems to be not in our interest. And the tenders committee might want to look at this matter again.
One other question in terms of getting some clarity. From the perspective of management of the public service, and you have spent a lot of years in that capacity, what do you see as the critical faults in the administration of the port and port-related services that come up at you in all of this?
Well, that would be a brave man, I think, to answer that, because I really know nothing about the administration of the port. It does seem to me, from what I've been reading and hearing, that a finger of blame is being pointed at the management of the port. I heard the Prime Minister on Monday talk about Mr. Leon Grant, and I'm aware of the fact, as we all are, that Mr. Grant has been suspended. For what reason, I don't know, because I have not seen his letter of suspension, which I imagine sets out the reason for suspension, because you can't just suspend someone just like that. And I take it that Mr. Grant will be appearing again before you to respond to these remarks that have been made. It would be, I think, unwise of me to go further than that, because at this point, because Mr. Grant has to be given, and the management of the port generally, but Mr. Grant in particular, because his name has been called, has to be given the opportunity within the framework of natural justice to respond to what has been said about him. And we will have to hear what his response is. I would need to hear what his response is before I can come to any conclusion, however preliminary, on the type of administration and management that the port has or may need.
One of the things that struck me in all of this relate to the past board and the current board of the Port Authority. And some of it was displayed in terms of the past board, in terms of the lack of harmony and coordination within that board. And those present gave testimony to that. And the concern came up by their own admission, because they introduced the phrase of norming and storming. And it was clear that there was a lack of direction provided from the ministry in terms of ensuring that this motley team were welded together ASAP, so that when it came to the second board, the current board, my concern was that given all the talk of strategic planning and business plans and so on, and the transformation of the public service vis-a-vis that kind of approach to management and public administration, at this stage of the game, the new board admitted to not having a strat plan or a business plan. And I had a concern with that, given what I think to be the ongoing guidelines that ministries and state agencies should have that, and that should be the basis of their requests for annual funding. So, and we are approaching the budget speech. So I'm wondering to the extent to which, and we were talking about the collapse of institutions, I'm wondering whether the whole system, the governmental system, and not just institutions per se, are in a state of some kind of pre-collapse.
You sound like Lloyd Best. I don't even know, I don't know if you do, Chairman, whether the people on the current board satisfy the qualifications and experience mentioned in the Act, the Port Authority Act. Because Section 3, subsection 2 of the Port Authority Act says that the authority shall consist of no fewer than 5, no more than 9 persons, and of these persons, 5 shall be appointed from amongst persons who have special qualifications in and have had experience of matters relating to engineering, accountancy, law, economics, or business management. Now, this is not the place to ask people what their qualifications are, but I would like to start there. I think perhaps we should start there. Has the board been properly constituted on the basis of the Act in terms of the qualifications and experience that at least 5 members of the board, and I think it's at the moment 7, should have? I don't know. Nor am I going to try to find out. On the question of a strategic plan, that could come out of the issue of the qualifications. Because if you have people with, or not sufficient people, with the relevant and requisite qualifications, it might be difficult, if not impossible, for the board or the management to come up with a strategic plan, because that demands a certain knowledge of plans, how you get to the plan, what you do, how you go about doing it, etc., etc. I don't know. Again, that is something that you may want to check into. But in any case, I would have thought that it would not be for the board to start off with a strategic plan, it would be for the management to submit a plan to the board. And I don't know whether the management, I don't know what the qualifications of the management are, I have no idea. And I have no idea whether the management has ever submitted a plan, strategic or otherwise. Although we have a number of reports on the board, on the port, sorry, whether the management has ever submitted a plan to a board, I don't know. But I certainly agree with you on the principle that if you don't know your past, then you don't know your present. And if you don't know your present, you don't know where you're going. So yes, there should be a plan. The plan, as the other member there mentioned earlier as to what could come out of this, should not be something that is clearly confined only to the port, because the port has influence outside of the port itself on the population as a whole. And so all of that has to be taken into account. The inter-island ferry, the operations of the ferry, the operations of the development of the marine sector. I don't know what that is at the moment. I have no idea what is happening. I don't know. The development of the Panama Canal, what impact might that have on the port of Spain, or the port of San Fernando, or any other port? I don't know. I don't know if any plan has ever been done. I don't know if, I don't know what has happened or has been happening. It could be that all these things exist. If they do, I certainly have not heard of them, but then that would not be surprising, because that is not my area of focus and continuing interest. But yes, I think that this committee might want to look at all of that.
I had asked them when they were here before. You know.
Oh, you asked them already?
Yeah,
And what
they
did
said no.
They said no.
Yeah.
Well-
So when I asked for your comment, was in terms of
Well, it
your
certainly should exist.
views on that fact
No,
as
no,
a
no,
fact.
well, that is frightening because this is 2017.
And I raised it in the wider context, the wider systemic context, because it's not just a reflection on them that they don't have it, that two successive boards didn't have it, because the second board, the current board, would have come into office and should have asked for the
Yes.
old plan to review. So, you know, that tells you something. And going further, it tells you something if the budgetary process has been engaged. I mean, I'm sure wherever the budget is, it's about to be delivered.
Well, you wonder what kind of budget there could be if you have no plan.
Well, and that's it. It means then that the Ministry of Finance has some licks to take, because they are the ones should require this of institutions coming forward for requests from the state's purse. So if you are coming for requests from the state's purse and you don't have a plan, should we? And I don't know about in your time, but in my time, as a public servant, if you didn't submit that, I mean, sent to the back of the class.
Yes,
and
well, you certainly had to justify your requests. I mean, you can't just, you're dealing with taxpayers' money, for God's sake. You can't just put up something in a vacuum and say, I want this, I want that. What do you want it for? Furthermore, and this is something, and I hope that you can consider this for your report, because it goes across the board, and it's very worrying to me. What I have discovered recently is that what I would call the silo mentality in the public sector, but let us concentrate on the public service, is well developed. In other words, ministries are putting up notes to cabinet, individual ministries, or whatever, matters pertaining to their particular portfolios, but which are connected to the portfolios of other ministries. But they are not consulting those other ministries before putting up the notes. So what we are having increasingly in the country, in the public service, is a series of solitudes, of bureaucratic solitudes, where the Ministry of X wants this, and the Ministry of Y wants that, and the Ministry of Z wants the other. And this continues with no linkage or insufficient linkage among the ministries. This is bad governance, expensive governance, because you're repeating things, you're duplicating things, and you're costing the taxpayer far more money.
Which brings me back to the specifics of this particular investigation, because one of the things emerging has been the question of the transfer of technology, transfer of expertise, which is where the Magellan Company came in. They were hustling to replace Bay Ferries on the issue, not to replace Bay Ferries, what Bay Ferries was doing, but to replace Bay Ferries and the issue of the transfer of knowledge and expertise, because there was the superfast Galicia about to ride off into the sunset, or sail off, I should say. And for the time that they were here, insufficient attention, practically no attention had been paid to that issue. And Mr. Macmillan, is his name, testified before us that when he was brought in to try to effect that, at first he was told about a year or so he had to try to get something going. And then it was reduced to an even shorter period, which was virtually impossible. And he picked up at that point in time, at any rate, there was clear hostility on the part of the departing crews to share anything with the locals whose job it fell to him to try to get them on board, to get them familiar so that, the transfer of knowledge and expertise could take place even belatedly. And I think that is connected to your point about silos, because if there is this board of permanent secretaries, you would remember, and of deputy permanent secretaries, that should have been picked up there and the process facilitated, either with local training or whatever they could come up with, but that should have been on their priority list. Here it is, we are underdeveloped as a seafaring people. We're not rising above fish and pirogues.
I agree. But may I ask, how long was that company here, Bay Ferries? How many years?
We understand 11 years.
11 years. What was done in the course of that 11 years regarding the transfer of technology?
From the crew members, I had to expedite that process.
No, Macmillan, you say came in towards the end.
Yeah, and they're saying
but
nothing was done. They had to
nothing
start
was
from
done.
scratch.
Well, whose fault was that? You see, to whom did the ferry belong? To us? Was it our ferry? Was it our boat? If it was our boat that we pay for, and we are paying Bay Ferries to operate the boat or whatever, we're paying them, they're agents, then it is our responsibility to ensure that the technology is transferred, not Bay Ferries' responsibility. It's our boat. Therefore, it is we who were remiss. It is we who should have put in place a plan for the transfer of the technology to set up a proper boat repair or marine sector or within the marine sector. Indeed, we should have been sitting down talking about a marine sector. What kind of marine sector do we want to see? Which would involve a number of things, of which boat repair and ship management, etc., would be parts. But if after 10 years of the 11, we only just discover, oh God, we ain't do nothing, we go send Macmillan to see what he could do. Whose fault is that?
Point taken.
Mr. Chair, just through you at this point, you want to ask a question? No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Just a clarification, Mr. Dumas, to allay your fears and perhaps those of the public,
To what, sorry?
to allay your concern
Uh-huh.
that somehow budgeting is done in a vacuum without any planning or any of that. I'm sure you're very familiar with the procedure that governs this, where planning ministry in particular vets all of the proposals from ministries, and you're called to task in terms of your spending on one hand, and then those projections for the next year on the other hand. This procedure still obtains and is perhaps more stringent now.
Okay.
So don't leave with the impression that
But no.
it is somehow ad hoc and arbitrary and it doesn't obtain
No, we
anymore.
were talking specifically about the port.
Yeah.
And we were saying that there seems to be an operation by VAPS
Right.
in the port.
Okay.
Now, if a budget is being put forward for port operations, on what basis is that budget being submitted? If we are operating by VAPS, I don't know.
No.
So I'm saying,
My contention is that the notion that it is just VAPS is erroneous.
oh, so
That these procedures still obtain
in the
and
port,
everywhere.
everywhere.
It still obtains.
Oh, so the port
I
is not, the
don't
port, the port
want
is
to
not,
leave you with that
the port
false
is not so
impression.
bad after all.
No, it is not. It is not that bad.
Okay.
Thank
So
you,
it's
sir.
not, it's not an area of iniquity.
No. Well, that's a separate issue, sir.
No, you can contradict your prime minister if you like, no problem.
All right, Mr. Dumas, do you care to make a closing statement?
I thought,
No, he passed.
oh, he's passed. No, except to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members for inviting me here, and to express the hope that the exchange has been helpful to you, because, I don't know, it's up to you to decide whether what I said and what I wrote is of any assistance. And to underline the hope expressed by Member Francis that something positive will come out of this committee's work with regard to the sea bridge on which Tobago depends so much, and on which the people of Trinidad and Tobago more broadly also depend. And with reference also to the hospitality sector and the linkage between the sea bridge and the hospitality sector in Tobago, which is very important because that is essentially the economy of Tobago. I think we want to get away in Tobago from CPEP and URP and fellows with weed whackers waking you up at 6 in the morning or 5:30 in the morning, and then they go, if they wake you at 5:30, they're gone at 6. So, we want to get away from that kind of thing. So, once again, thank you very much.
Much for your time and your patient wait. Okay. This hearing is suspended for 15 minutes.